Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Porco Rosso from 1992. And this is continuing my quest to review all the films of Studio Ghibli, two directors who were at the peak of their technical level and fame, and then turned around and made two very fun but technically gifted movies. And those two movies I'm thinking of would be North by Northwest by Alfred Hitchcock and Raiders of the Lost Ark by Steven Spielberg. And they're amazingly well done. They feel sometimes a little lighter, a little more fun. They're kind of the movie you'd want to rewatch the most from them. Porco Rosso is that with Hayao Miyazaki. I've often thought of it as Hayao Miyazaki's Raiders of the Lost Ark, and it is that fantasy action film that when a director's gone to a certain level, he can really nail. It's definitely Miyazaki's funnest and lightest film. There's no real big arc with Porco Rosso the way there is with Kiki and the girls from Totoro. It's a film that was designed to be a fun cartoon, especially for middle-aged men traveling on a plane. He even refers to it in a pitch for the film that its real intended audiences are businessmen in their 40s who are traveling on a plane, who catch it, whose brains are tofu at that point. That kind of escapism, that kind of an adult major studio kind of cartoon, the way you think of, like I mentioned before, Raiders of the Lost Ark, but also James Bond, that kind of action fantasy. And this is, I think, the kind of action fantasy that Hayao Miyazaki would want to watch. Now, this is based on a manga that he wrote, Age of the Flying Boat, which was only a short story. It wasn't ongoing the way Nausicaa was. He actually referred to the fact numerous times that he felt that an animated film could capture what he was doing in the manga a lot better. He says he didn't have plans at that time, but it seems like, why bring it up then? It was his kind of fun escapist James Bond kind of thing, but instead of having a guy with lots of gadgets or with a bullwhip, he has a World War I flyer bounty hunter who has to beat another flyer in a contest. I think it shows Hayao Miyazaki's interest, but also the kind of fun film that he could make with Porco Rosso. Looser cartoon, and when he really wants to have fun. This is probably the most fun we ever saw him have with Porco Rosso. That's why for some people it's a little more difficult, because it is a little more fun, more action fantasy than the ones before it. Kids can watch it, like kids can watch James Bond films, but it's not as designed for that. Although it was a big hit in Japan in 1992, it was the highest grossing film of that year in Japan. A lot of people have noticed it's not as big in America, and I think maybe it doesn't fit into the canon of the Miyazaki classics, but in a way it's almost so Miyazaki it's ridiculous. His attention to detail with a lot of the 1920s planes, the European setting, a pig. He likes pigs for some reason, and this romanticization of European culture, in this film Italy. And it kind of wraps up everything that he really loves on display in this beautifully fun action cartoon fantasy. A former World War I fighter pilot who was magically turned into a pig. We don't actually know how. It seems like a lot of people have jumped to conclusions about that, whether it's because he left the army or what. You don't really see anyone else who's turned into any other sort of animals, but he's a pig. And he is a very famous and very good bounty hunter, and you open on the film as he's saving a bunch of girls from a group of air pirates who kidnap them, and he saves them and makes lots of money. But you kind of get the impression the air pirates don't really like him, since he is often called upon to ruin their well-laid plans, which aren't really well laid out. And after the pirates decide to take him down, they hire another younger American pilot named Donald Curtis. He does take Porco Rosso's plane down as he is trying to go to Milan for repairs for his plane. The plane crashes, but he eventually finds a way to get off of a deserted island with his plane, goes to Milan to his mechanic friend Piccolo to get his plane fixed and redesigned, only to find out that all his sons who helped design the planes before have gone to find work because they're in kind of an economic depression. This film supposedly takes place in the 20s during a previous European depression, not the Great Depression as we know it, or supposedly. It's a little unclear, although I think it says 29, so I don't know which depression it is. There's a lot of, since all of his sons are gone, he has his granddaughter Fio, who at first Porco Rosso doesn't want her to work there because she's first a girl and first very young, but then realizes that she's very, very good at designing planes, so he asks her to help him and designs an incredibly good plane, but she wants to go with him, and he goes and tries to take down Donald Curtis in a big shootout in the sky to get back at what he did to his plane. A lot of Hayao Miyazaki's films are really based on European settings. He went to a lot of European locations to scout and for research, and this is the only one that is very specific to a country, that would be Italy. And and even mentions real cities and a geographical time, that being the 1920s. It's a very Italian film. Even the character of Gina looks almost like French or Italian animation, her character design in a lot of ways. Miyazaki made a lot of very Japanese films, but this film I think is his most influenced by another culture. Originally this was just going to be 45 minutes in-flight program for Japanese airlines, but Miyazaki got so into it he decided to keep making it and give it a little bit more of a serious tone. To me it's so much of a fun Hollywoodish action adventure kind of film, probably the most he's done with that since Lupita, I think, and it has kind of a similar slant as Lupita in which he wanted to make a fun cartoon movie, that kind of fantasy action film. And it kind of reminds me of what he did with the Lupin the Third movie, The Castle of Cagliostro, in which he really just goes for it and tries to make it as much fun as he possibly can, especially with the animation. The flying sequences in this, in some ways, it's a little more realistic in terms of the planes can do and kind of like footage of planes like that at the time and World War I planes and flyers of that era. He makes it very cartoony. Obviously, you have a flying pig. Funny enough, I didn't think of when pigs fly pun. That's obvious with this movie, but whatever. And a lot of the action sequences, it does kind of have a kind of realism to it, and it makes it feel in that way kind of more like a live action film. He doesn't go full on fantasy. That's more of what you would see in a big budget Hollywood fantasy, or at least at this time. And it kind of reminds me of how a lot of Americans romanticize the World War II era with The Rocketeer or Raiders of the Lost Ark. But he does romanticize an era that he likes, which is the post-World War I flyers and how that was interesting to him. It's all fantasy, but it's all the love of that fantasy and of that era and the flyers of that era. The previous director, who I'm trying to do all of his filmography as well, was William Wellman, who was a flyer in World War I and made a lot of films about flyers, including Wings, which is one of the best films about World War I flyers ever made. I myself kind of romanticize this era, and I've actually noted in a podcast at one point and in other places that William Wellman would probably really like this film. It gets that era, but it also gets kind of the comic book fun of that era and gives you the kind of things you would really want from it. It's the ultimate fun World War I flyer movie. I was actually thinking about Wellman and how I think the one film he kind of didn't make was a film like this one, and I think he would have been really good at it. And in a way, I think if he had made it, some of the action sequences, he couldn't have done the things with the camera that Miyazaki can, obviously, because this is animated. Some of the shots in this of the dogfights, especially the World War I dogfight, feels like footage from that era. It feels like it's out of Hell's Angels or Wings. Other shots are things you could only do in animation, and it shows one of the strengths animation has. You don't have to hook up the camera to a plane to do something. He takes advantage of that, but he doesn't lose the era at all. He kind of infuses it with it. This film has a lot of different dubs, and it actually has some of the better dubs, I think, of any of his films in different languages. But one of the interesting things about it is apparently Hayao Miyazaki said he actually prefers the French language voice cast, and particularly Jean Reno as Porco Rosso, over the Japanese cast. And I can't find much about an Italian cast, which you'd think this film would be perfect for that. I was actually thinking I'd like to hear the Italian voice cast because this film is so very much Italian. Michael Keaton played Porco Rosso in America, and everyone seems to get into those roles because they're the kind of fun, big Hollywood movie roles that you think about when you're 7 years old. I think it's as accessible for me as an adult as it would be for a 7-year-old kid. That's one of the majesties of Hayao Miyazaki's storytelling, is that he is able to do those things and have such well-written and well-told stories. It's something that people like about both the James Bond series and the Indiana Jones series, or at least when they're done well, because they kind of represent the finest in Hollywood filmmaking. And Porco Rosso definitely feels that way as well, but it has a looseness to it that those films could never really aim to have. His antagonists always grow with the film. It's always like a major character arc, even in his Lupin the Third movie. I don't really think Porco Rosso has an arc so much in this film. I really wouldn't say that. Kind of like James Bond usually doesn't have an arc in his films either. Other people in the film have arcs, like Donald Curtis, who was originally called Donald Chuck, which I'm assuming they changed for legal reasons, but I don't know. Or the girl Theo. It feels like he really wanted to do something different and have fun with it, and obviously he fell in love with this kind of a film. When you look at his filmography, as much as people say, oh, all Studio Ghibli and all Miyazaki films are the same, I disagree with it a lot, because I've often noticed throughout this filmography how little these films have to do with one another. There's definite similarities. I've often heard about going through a director's filmography, you're going to learn a lot about repetition, and I don't find that with this. Like Kiki, both these main characters can fly, but I noticed the flight and the flying imagery in this film felt more striking than the way Kiki did, because it's more based on like actual flight. Kiki can fly around where the fuck she wants. She's on a broomstick, it's magical and all that stuff. It's interesting also that this doesn't really have a villain. He kind of gets along with Donald Curtis. Everyone is kind of friendly. They're antagonists in one scene, but then he's friendly with some of the sea pirates later, and it never feels false. It feels like a real world. Like these guys have probably gotten drunk together at certain points, but then they hate each other at other points. It feels like real guys who work together and share the same profession. The way that Miyazaki uses that world kind of gives it a different feel to it. I think that's one of the things that, as much as these feel like Spielberg or Hollywood productions, in those you really have to have a strong antagonist. And Miyazaki doesn't seem to really need to do that. He doesn't really seem as interested in that. He just wants to tell a really good story. It's more about honor and everyone respecting him than anything else, and that's about it. But him and Donald Curtis are fairly good friends at the end. The manga that this was based on was only 3 parts, and if you look at the 3 parts, at least the descriptions of them, it kind of summarizes the film in a little bit of ways. At least the last 2 were primary influences on this film. It seems like the first one, there's some debate. I haven't read them, so I can't really say, but from the little knowledge I understand, they kind of are. Great storytellers and great directors want to do the fun film that they're going to watch all the time on TV. They don't necessarily always want to do the big, huge project. They want to do the film that when it's on a Saturday afternoon and they have nothing to do, they want to lay back on the couch and have a great time. Just the way, you know, your dad used to freak out about the James Bond TBS marathons. Porco Rosso is Hayao Miyazaki's James Bond TBS marathon, and he sells that and does it so well with all the love that people have with that kind of an action-adventure fantasy film, and makes it probably one of the more enjoyable films of his entire filmography and of Studio Ghibli's as well. So if you have seen Porco Rosso and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And check out my other Studio Ghibli reviews in my Studio Ghibli review playlist, and thank you for watching. Hope to see you next time.